Good morning, everyone. We are up to Mishna, Perek Aleph, Mishna Zion, Chapter 1, Mishna Zion of Seches Masris. And the Mishnayos are now continuing, discussing what is considered Gemar Malacha, the completion of process for different foods, to say that now one may not even snack from them unless he has separated the Trimas and the Maisris. Hayayin, when it comes to wine, Meshiyah Kafe. Meshiyah Kafe means when you skim it. Now, before we talk about wine, we really should go through the winemaking process. Let me read to you how the art scroll spells it out. In the times of the Mishnah, wine was made by placing grapes on a slanted surface, known as the upper wine press, Gasa El Yoina, upper wine press, and stepping on them to squeeze out their juice. The juice would then flow down the slanted surface through a pipe, which is called a tzinar, and into a cistern, which is called the bar, where it would stay to ferment. As it fermented, grape seeds and pieces of peel that had flowed into the cistern along with the juice would gradually rise to the top and would be removed. The juice was then poured into barrels where it would spend more time fermenting. So this point that we just mentioned about skimming off the seeds and the skins from the top, that is what the Mishnah means when it says that the processing of the wine is completed for the purposes of Shemus and Maisris, you can't snack from it, is once you skim off those pits and skins. Next, the Mishnah continues, Af al pi shekipa. Now, even though he has done that to the wine, this is done, as he said, this is done on the wine that's in the bar, in the cistern. Even though he has done that to the wine that's there, he can still basically collect from the upper wine press and from the pipe and drink. Meaning, before, even though, again, we already have wine in the cistern and you have skimmed the top of it, nonetheless, the wine that hasn't reached there yet is not considered processed. And therefore, the wine that's still in the upper wine press, or the wine that's flowing through, the grape juice rather, that's flowing through the pipe, you can drink from it not in a regular fashion, but in a kind of snack fashion, because they're not processed yet. So even though you already maybe have a lot of wine that's processed in the cistern, and this is heading towards a cistern, nonetheless, this wine itself has not yet been completely processed, and therefore you can snack from it. All right, so that's what the Mishnah says regarding wine. Now they're just going to talk about oil, olive oil. So I'm going to read to you the process, how olive oil was made. In the times of the Mishnah, oil was made by crushing olives to a pulp with a mortar or millstone. The olive pulp was then placed in a rough sack, typically made of ropes woven together. A heavy beam would be lowered onto the sack to squeeze the oil out of the pulp, and the oil would flow through the sack into a trough where it was collected. That's the process. That's the process of how they made olive oil. So now, what is the point of Gemar Malacha? What is the point of its complete processing for it regarding Trimas and Maisris? So the Mishnah says, Hashemen, when it comes to oil, Mishayerid la'uka, when it goes into the trough. Once it goes into the trough, it's processed. It's done. Av al pi sheyared. Now, even though you have oil that has gone to the trough, you can still snack on, or you can still take off. Again, and the example is going to be given are examples that would be the equivalent of a snack, but you can take from the akel. The akel is the sack. That's the akel. The akel is the sack that we said the olive pulp is put into. You want to take some oil out of there? It's not processed yet. That's the akel. The memo is the oil from under the millstone stuck to it when you first crushed the olives. You first crushed the olives in the millstone. There's still some oil stuck there. Well, you can take that oil. That's the memo. And then you have the patzim. The patzim are the boards. What that means is oil from between the boards of the oil press that never flowed into the trough, right? The boards are there. The oil is supposed to now go through the boards into the trough, and instead it got stuck between the boards. Okay, so in all these cases, where the oil hasn't been into the trough yet, that oil is not considered processed. So you can collect it, says the Mishnah, and you can put it either into a chamita. A chamita is a hot wafer, or a tamchoy, or is a serving dish. Okay, so the Mishnah is saying like this: when you take that unprocessed oil, right, which we say is unprocessed, and now you can use it in a snacking way. So the first example giving a snacking way is putting on the hot wafer. They used to kind of take out these hot wafers, and they would smear oil on it when it was still hot and fresh. So we're saying that unprocessed oil, you can now smear on the hot wafer and eat it as a snack. And eat it. Okay? There's no meal eating of the oil yet in this point. And therefore, just going in and smearing it onto the wafer is going to be permissible to do. You don't got to worry about shumas and maasros. The same thing, let's say you want to add it to a serving plate. You've got a food in a serving plate. You want to put it on, add the oil to that food. You can do that. Now let's read further the Mishnah to understand what the discussion here is really about. But you cannot put this unprocessed oil into a pot or into a frying pan when they are still hot. The explanation is like this. We mentioned yesterday that the Rabbanan instituted that even before the produce is brought into the house, when the processing is completed, already at that point, you may not snack anymore. And there were certain things, but we said that there were certain things that have to take place or could take place that would actually forbid snacking before it got into your house. One of those things was cooking. Cooking, it seems actually cooking is going to work, even though you have this oil, and the oil is not processed, not completely processed yet. If you cook it, cooking is kaveh l'maiser. Cooking now gives it the full-fledged obligation of maiser. You can't snack from it. So now when you add this oil to the hot foods, the hot foods we're talking about right now, are you cooking the oil or are you not cooking the oil? If you're cooking the oil, then you're not going to be able to eat from it anymore because you have to separate the maasros from it before you can eat from it, even in a snack, even if it's for a snack. But if it's not considered cooking, so then I haven't been kaveh l'maiser, I haven't done anything that now establishes the full-fledged obligation for shumas and maasros to say even snacking is not permissible, and I'll be okay. So the Mishnah says like this. If we're talking about a pot, meaning a pot that came off the fire, that's the point. The pot that came off the fire, which we call in halacha a kli rishon. It's the pot that was on the fire. Even it's not on the fire anymore, but it's still hot. It has the ability to cook. And therefore, if you're going to go ahead and take this pot off the fire or the frying pan off the fire, and they're both still hot, then we say that if you're going to add anything to it, it's going to cook it. Okay, so if I add the unprocessed oil to the pot or to the frying pan while they're still hot, I'm cooking the oil. If I'm cooking the oil, that's kaveh l'maiser. That gives it now a full obligation of shumas and maasros that says I can't snack from it. I'm not going to be able to eat it. But if you're putting it, let's say, into the serving dish, when the food is in the serving dish, that's called a kli sheni. That's called the second vessel. That's one vessel removed from the vessel that was on the fire. And the rule is, very often, that a kli sheni ain't a mavashal. A kli sheni, the second vessel, which is the serving dish, at that point, already the food is cooling off in a way that it's not going to cook. And therefore, I can add the oil to that. So if the food is in the serving dish, that means it's in a kli sheni, in a second vessel. If I add the unprocessed oil there, I'm still okay, because I haven't cooked the oil to say that now it was kaveh l'maiser, that now it gets obligation for maiser even for snacking. The same thing regarding the wafer. Even though the wafer is coming out of the oven, it's hot and it's straight out of the oven. But the explanation is that since the wafer is very thin, it begins to cool quickly after being taken out of the oven, does not cook the oil. That's by this wafer, this thin wafer. Well, it's coming straight out of the oven and it's hot. Because it's so thin, once it's out of the oven, it already loses the ability to cook, and therefore the unprocessed oil will not be cooked, and therefore you'll be okay to eat it. So that's what's going on here in the Mishnah that talks about you can put it onto the wafer or onto the serving food at the serving dish, but you cannot put it into a pot or into a frying pan. Now, if the pot and the frying pan cooled off, they're not hot, you get out the oil, it's not going to cook it. That's why the Mishnah says reischen. So even though they're a kli rishon, the pot was on the fire. Once it cools down, it's not going to cook anymore. Rabbi Yehuda says, La kol hu neisein. This unprocessed oil can be put into anything we mentioned until now, including the pot and the frying pan. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is you can add this oil, unless we're talking about these things. These again, we're referring to the pot and to the frying pan. If they have in them vinegar or brine, then, meaning if they have a food in there and the food contains vinegar or brine, that food contains those things, then Rabbi Yehuda says, then it will cook the oil. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, the kli rishon, the frying pan or the pot that just came off the fire, and it's hot, it's not going to cook. Doesn't cook. Doesn't change the food enough to be considered cooking. But if it has brine or vinegar in it, then already the sharpness and the vinegar, plus the fact that we're talking about a hot food that was in a kli rishon, then it will have the ability to cook it. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says the only time there'll be a problem of adding the oil to the hot pot or hot frying pan is if it contains a food that has brine or vinegar. Then it will cook it. Otherwise, it won't. Right? Tanura says the halach is not like Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore we follow the Tanakama that says even if it doesn't have brine or vinegar, if we're talking about a kli rishon, like a pot that was on the fire or a frying pan that was on the fire and it's still hot, if you add the oil, it's going to cook it, and then you won't be able to eat it. But if we're talking about a thin wafer or we're talking about food's ready in a serving dish, then you would be able to add it. Okay. So today we're actually about to do the very last mitzvah that is in this Sefer, this book, Sefer Mitzvah Hakatza, the concise book of mitzvahs. Today is the last one. So in the past, what we've done in Shul after Shachris was we did the Sefer Chavetz Chaim, the laws of the laws about the prohibition of speaking Lashon Hara, and then after that a couple of times we switched to this work of the Chavetz Chaim, which was the concise book of mitzvahs. So today we're going to complete it. And in Mitzvah Shem tomorrow, we're going to go back to Chavetz Chaim to study the laws of the prohibition of speaking Lashon Hara. Prohibition against allowing idol worshippers to sell in Eretz Yisrael. As it says, they shall not dwell in your land lest they cause you to sin, lest you cause you to worship idols. We don't sell them houses or fields in Eretz Yisrael, as it states, which means don't give them a hold in the ground, in the land. You can rent houses to them to use for storage, but not for the purpose of dwelling. Because idol worship brings into their idols. The Torah says, you shall not bring any kind of abomination referring to idols into your house. Now let's say this person who's not Jewish accepted the 7 mitzvahs, the 7 Noachide laws, raising a Toshev. If he's gone through that process, and there's a process, he has to do it in a beis, do it in a rabbinical court, then he's called a ger Toshev. That means a foreign sojourner, literally in translation. He's not a full-fledged convert, but he has accepted to do the 7 mitzvahs, the Sheva mitzvah Noach, the 7 Noachide laws, and he accepted that in a rabbinical court. Then you're allowed to sell it to him. The rule is, though, that we only do this process of ger Toshev when the Jubilee year, the 50th year, we have 7 years, every 7th year is the Shemitah. After 49 years, the 49th year is Shemitah. The 50th year is also Shemitah. And the 50th year also, there's a law that lands that were sold revert back to their original owner, and Jewish slaves are automatically free. So that's called the Yovel, the Jubilee year, the 50th year. The rule is that accepting and giving a status of a Ger Toshav to someone only applies when Yovel applies. And therefore, since nowadays Yovel doesn't apply, neither does that apply. Therefore, one cannot sell to a non-Jew. This applies at all times, both by men and by women. So again, Mazel Tov, we went through this whole work. I'm sure you understand that, the laws discussed here are, they are the kind of the basic rules. We're not going to, these are the general rules rather of the mitzvahs. There's many different details and many different situations and many different laws that can change the situation, that govern when exactly the mitzvah is applicable. But what we've been doing now is basically getting the general rules, and the Chavetz Chaim wrote this book so that we should be aware and knowledgeable of the mitzvahs that are relevant to us nowadays. Exactly how to apply them, of course, that takes a lot more study to be able to know properly. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful day. And again, Mitzvah Shem, tomorrow we continue Mishnayos and we start the Sefer Chavetz Chaim.